start. Today we have two of the premier experts in their fields, we believe, institutional-like, these two organizations in our mind. And you'll get to know more about Ross Duvall's Heartland Forward organization, which is going to be a tremendous resource for us relative to understanding our economy and how we can grow it. And so I'm really excited to have Ross to be a part of our program today. We'll talk a little more about Ross, but he's building a wonderful research institution. It's a think and do tank, and it's all focused on the Heartland. And we've known Ross for a lot of years. He helped us a whole lot in the prior decade when we were working on the initial efforts of the knowledge economy and technology. And he built a tremendous report that gave us a launching pad. So we're very grateful he's here today. And as Dr. Joe and I were just talking, we miss seeing him, and we really look forward to hearing from Dr. Joe Thompson. We think he's the very best at what he does. He educates us more than just informs us. That's what we like about him, and just a tremendous resource. So our 17th open forum with Dr. Joe Thompson and Ross Duvall, we'll talk about health, and then we'll talk about the economy. I can't think of two more important topics to cover, and that's what we try to do in these forums, is bring you the best information we can that helps you lead your organizations. On the 22nd of September, we have Stan Zalowski from Movista. Stan has done more, he was responding probably as well as any organization in trying to iterate how he's going about being in the marketplace and adding value. Just a tremendous story. Mike Smith's on the call here. He's in our CO Tech forum that Mike Smith leads. It's got a tremendous forum going with Stan and others. And then Sidney Moncrief is going to come on. He's got a new book out on diversity, inclusion, and equity, and is doing workshops around with that, and it's getting some really good momentum. He's got a great book, and matter of fact, it's right here. It's well done. It's a good tool. So we'll hear from Sidney and Stan on the September 22nd at 10:30. So that'll be a Tuesday. We're moving to Tuesday because Wednesday conflicted with a couple of our forums. We apologize for moving around a little on you there, but that's what we needed to do, and we appreciate everybody working with us on that. So what we're going to do, we're going to start with Dr. Joe Thompson, and then we'll have Ross Duvall follow up. Ross, I put a newsletter out that had a lot of questions about, I know you can answer all those if we had enough time, but we may not have enough time to answer every question that I put in the little newsletter, but he will get to a whole lot of, you'll be excited about what a resource you have in Ross Duvall in our region. And we're also excited about Dr. Joe and the resource he provides. So Dr. Joe, take it away, please, sir.
Tim, thank you for having us. And again, I think your agenda of our health and our economy are intertwined in ways they have never been as tight. So we are now, this is what, our 6th month of doing this. We've been in the COVID space for almost a little over half a year. I can remember I had my last board meeting on March the 13th. That was the last in-person meeting I've had. And on March the 14th, everything kind of shut down. All right, well, let's jump in here. We're 6 months into the COVID. I think we're all getting tired of it. Here's the bad news, and I'll just put it up front. These are the number of deaths and how long it took us to get to the next 100 in Arkansas over the last 6 months. You'll note that, we didn't get a heavy dose of the COVID early on, and then we shut down. So it took us about 70 days to get to the first 100 deaths. But each subsequent 100 has taken a shorter and shorter period of time. And to go from 700 to 800 only took us 8 days in the last week plus a day. So I just want to emphasize this thing is in our communities. It is affecting our communities. And it is a bad virus. We're learning more clinically. We're learning that it's not just a respiratory illness, that it affects other organs in your body, and we'll touch on that. And for individuals that have any of the conditions that we've talked about before, you're on cancer drugs, high-dose steroids, you have kidney problems, you have congestive heart failure. This virus doesn't attack you more frequently, but when it attacks you, your body is less able to resist it, and you become more susceptible to bad outcomes. So this is my bad news I thought I would start with. This is our website that I hope y'all have visited. We have since we were together last. started putting up geographic information that we are getting from the health department and converting into more specific geographic information. On the next slide is actually zip code specific information. You can go on our website and look at how many active cases are in your zip code as a rate per 10,000. The darkest counties, the darkest zip codes here have more than 100 cases per 10,000, or when you translate that, that's more than 1% of the people in those zip codes are actively infected today. So we're trying to drive information down for local decision makers to know when to really maximize your protections. We've started school since the last time we were together, and that has been a big concern for parents and school personnel, decision makers alike, community leaders. Similarly to the zip codes, we actually have put out school district level data by risk. We've got 5 different gradients. This is the rate of new cases in a 14-day period for the school districts. You'll see actually North Central Arkansas wasn't a problem until about 2 weeks ago when they had a traveling revival come through in those school districts. And Hector and Dover really spiked up. Our gradient here that we use, we borrowed from Minnesota, where they have 5 different kind of levels of policy options depending on what the concentration of new cases per 10,000 are. If you're in the lowest risk, students of all grades can go in person. As your risk grows, the middle and high school would go hybrid, with elementary still being in person because it's more difficult for them to have education over the technical facilitated spaces. As you go up in risk, obviously you have more and more decentralized at home. And then finally, if you're at 50 or more, those red counties would recommend that you are doing virtual instruction only. We're trending the data for school districts over time. We provide a rate for the proportion of 14-day new cases per 10,000 for each of the school districts, and that's on our website, so you can go and look at your school district to see where you are. Starting last week, these are our trend rates here. It's alphabetical. You can search by your school district. Last week, the health department started publishing active cases in the schools themselves, whether those were staff or students, and so we actually have that on our website too. I come back, we're gonna have transmission. We have had transmission here in Little Rock. The Dunbar Middle School converted to virtual yesterday because 40 of their students and staff had to be quarantined because of an exposure. I think for the most part, our schools have opened well. We're gonna have to watch closely and react quickly when we have an infection. We're gonna have to maintain the efforts to have the physical distance, the hand hygiene, the masks, and we need to importantly use our data-driven processes to guide our decisions. We had football start last week, and we'll be rolling into full session this weekend. We are starting to see pop-ups in colleges and universities and track them across. Right now, you've got a pretty good fire. It's not yet an explosion up on the Fayetteville campus, but because of the infectiousness of this virus, I think that is a high-risk situation there. We also are putting up active cases by college and university. You've got almost 1,000 active cases on the university campus. Now, most of the students don't live in the university or don't live in the dorms of the university. So most of those cases are actually domiciled out into the Fayetteville community and beyond. So these are important for your communities. As a nation, since we were last together, we continue to climb with 6.3 million cases and almost 190,000 deaths. I mean, this is what is so frustrating. We have 4% of the world population, and we have 25% of the cases and over 20% of the deaths from this virus. We have gotten more control. You'll remember back in July, we were having 70,000 new cases a day. We're down to about 40. Europe, who has 1/3 more people than we have, they were under good control, but as they relaxed some of their transportation restrictions and so forth, they started to lose that control. So I think this is an important learning that once we get control, we've got to keep it. We are not in control now. Uncontrolled spread here is defined by a positivity rate over 14 days of more than 10%, and we are in that uncontrolled spread. We continue to have a heavy dose of COVID across the state. We have fewer hospitalizations. We were up over 500, and we were trending about 120 ventilated patients a day. We're now down to 400 and with fewer on the ventilator, but that death rate continues to go up. I think this is actually a measure of our clinical workforce learning how to better treat, again, with the balance of remdesivir on the treatment side and dexamethasone on the break side of our immune system when it gets out of hand. I think we're learning how to treat better going forward, but the deaths continue to mark us. These are our active cases per trauma system region. Y'all are creeping back up a little bit because of the university outbreak there in Northwest Arkansas. You were down about 1 to 1.5 cases per 1,000 before the university came back. And here you see those upticks for the different regions here, specifically your Northwest region there, which was the bottom line, now has a pretty steep uptick there, and I think that's a cause for concern going forward. We did have a big, run up after we loosened in June and July, and then with the mask mandate coming in the first week of August, we dropped it down through the month of August. As we went back to school, you see that uptick there towards the end of August, first part of September. It's reflected also in the number of active cases. We got control of it with the mask mandate there in August, and we were bringing it down, but we are seeing an uptick. The hospitalization rates, I mentioned, these have actually come down and leveled off some, I think because we're better able to treat the condition, and we're seeing fewer people spend as much time on the ventilator. So these are the average number of patients on a ventilator each day of the week. We see the number of hospitalizations actually continue to be higher for those in the middle and younger age groups, but the deaths, because of comorbid conditions and the fragility of individuals with those conditions, continue to be higher in our older age population. Although we have had deaths, down in the 25 to 44-year-old age population, knock on wood, so far none down in the younger age population. And I bring this time to the next 100 deaths back on the next slide because I think it is one that is really concerning, that we are escalating those death counts both in terms of numbers and time. One of the things that I think we are learning is that this is not just an acute respiratory infection or an acute infection. We're now starting to see the longer term effects. These are 3 different studies. JAMA had a study of patients 2 months after their recovery. 2/3 of these individuals had never even been in the hospital. 78 out of the 100, when they imaged their heart, had structural heart damage. Their ventricles were dilated. 60% had evidence of ongoing myocarditis or inflammation of the heart 2 months after resolution of their symptoms. Another study of individuals who had died found 41% of them had evidence of the virus infecting their heart. And a cause for concern, last week, the Penn State came out having studied Big Ten student athletes who had COVID. Nearly 15% of those COVID positive athletes showed signs of active heart inflammation weeks after their positive diagnosis. So I think some of the more concerning news we're learning about this virus is it not only causes an acute infection that you can succumb to, but this is evidence of 3 separate studies showing long-term late effects on the heart. And I think that may be one of the things that are pushing some of our death rates up as we move forward and learn more about this virus. We still have the same recommendations for isolation and quarantine. If you have been tested positive, if you have no symptoms, it's 10 days after your test. If you have symptoms, it's 10 days after the onset of your symptoms with resolution of fever and improvement in symptoms. If you were in the hospital, it's 20 days. And if you've been exposed but not been tested, it's 14 days after your exposure. And that doesn't matter whether you get a test result or not. That's 14 days. This hasn't changed. It continues to be one of the real challenges because it is a tricky virus. and can actually, even after you're exposed 7 to 10 days, you can manifest infection and become infectious, even if you had a negative test in the first few days after you were exposed. We still have the 3 categories of testing: the molecular test, which actually looks for the DNA and the RNA, the antigen test, which looks for particles of the virus's capsule. Increasingly, you have some of the blood tests that are looking for evidence of antibodies in the past. Just to focus for a second, if you have a positive molecular test, PCR test, or you have a positive antigen test, you have it. Consider yourself positive. There's been some discussion, the CDC and the health department have not been counting the antigen test in their total case numbers. I think I'm going to meet with my board tomorrow. I think it's time for us to start counting positive antigens along with the positive molecular test, particularly as we do more and more rapid antigen testing. That's a test that's being done on the Fayetteville campus for the most part. And so this really is an important recognition, is that the case counts that are out there do not currently count the rapid antigen test and probably undercount the number of infections we actually are having. Now on the antibody side, there's some positive information here that we've got coming forward from some other countries. There was a look at Iceland at a large proportion of their population. They looked at 30,000 persons 2 and 4 months after their initial wave. It's the largest known assessment of whether people developed and how long antibodies last after known infection, or whether they were quarantined or had no known exposure. They looked at the risk of death, and those most at risk of death that look very much like ours, so I won't go into too much detail there. A little bit of caution: Iceland is an island. They didn't get as much exposure as we got. They only had almost 1,800 cases by April and only had 13 cases between April and June 15th. So they really got control. But what they found, of all of their confirmed positive cases, 91% had developed antibodies by 2 months after their infection. And at 4 months, 91% had retained those antibodies. So this is, I think, a very positive finding, and that people who have the infection do develop antibodies, and that they last more than just a month or two. Now they'll follow those people to see if they last 6 months, 8 months, 12 months. But this is a question that we've had, is whether you mount an antibody response and whether the antibodies last. Now, of some concern, that they tested of all the COVID cases, when they found antibodies in people and they went back, only 56% of the people who had been infected had been tested and diagnosed. Of those who were quarantined but not tested, 14% of them developed antibodies, meaning they had been infected but never had symptoms. And 30% who'd never been tested or quarantined, people like us that have never had an exposure at all, developed antibodies, so that the exposure out in the community was significant. Their infection fatality rate was about 3 per 100,000. Our case fatality rate here in Arkansas is 26 per 100,000, and for the nation is 56 per 100,000. So they really did get control of their spread by locking things down quickly that we have not. But I think the important thing is we do develop antibodies, and the exposure is broader than we recognize in the community. Now, some important new news on our vaccine tracker. We've got a number of vaccines in the pipeline. We've got 24 that are in that phase 1 testing. Now, this is when let me do the phases first. So phase 1 is when they've gone through animal studies, they've gone through laboratory studies, they're actually injecting it into human beings. Phase 1 is a small study where they inject a potential vaccine into a small number of people to make sure that they don't have a broad number of adverse reactions. Phase 2 is then when they inject the vaccine to make sure that it's going to develop a response, that it's going to have antibodies. And then phase 3 is when they go to large-scale tests to see what the effectiveness and any adverse effects are. So we've now got worldwide 9 studies in that phase 3 trial, 3 of them in the United States: the Pfizer study, the AstraZeneca study, and the Oxford study. I mentioned the 3 that are limited. This you may recall, the Chinese Military Medical Academy has developed a vaccine that they're using in the Chinese military. There are a couple of others that are not gone through the safety study. So while I say limited, I don't think any of us would want those. I want to come back to the 3 that are in the United States. You may have seen on the news yesterday, AstraZeneca halted its study because of a single adverse effect. This is part of the safety protocols in these vaccine trials. They did the phase 1 study in a limited number of people. They did not have adverse effects. Then when they go to phase 3 and they're doing it in tens of thousands of people, the likelihood that they could discover some adverse effects goes up. So they have a separate safety committee that for any adverse event, and the adverse event did not result, to my knowledge, in the death of the individual, but it was significant enough that that safety committee halted the trial to study the effect and make sure that they did not have any more of those. So right now we have 3 trials underway, one of which is in a temporary halt in the United States, all of which are recruiting. And this just goes to, show that these are volunteers submitting themselves to a randomized controlled trial to see whether a vaccine works. Importantly, earlier this week, we had the vaccine manufacturers and the scientists come out with an explicit statement that they would not let the political process or the political environment infect, pun intended, the scientific process to get a safe vaccine to trial. I think we need to keep our eye on that. We have seen the CDC recommendations been politically influenced, and we've seen the FDA recommendations be politically influenced. So I think this is an important thing to stay focused on. I do want to just raise the ongoing effort of COVID-19 and stress in all aspects of our life, our professional, our personal, our social. This physical distancing can make people feel isolated and lonely. There's anxiety about our health, family, finances, job, difficulty with sleep and concentration, worsening of health problems, mental health conditions, increases in the use of tobacco and other substances. These are reality, and I just want to call it out. We have seen some issues. 53% of adults reported negative mental health impacts from stress and worry, and you see what those are here in the sub-bullets. More than 33% have reported symptoms of either anxiety or depression during the first half of last year. And a shocking number here is 11% had thoughts of suicide in the previous 30 days. Now, this is of the general population, including those that have more financial hardships, less stability probably than many of us on this phone call. But I just want to highlight this to encourage each of you to reach out, to your family members, to your, community members, even to relative strangers, and say, it's a stressful time. How are you doing? And really open the door up for people to, express stresses that they may be under and the effects that they may be facing. So it's been a pretty fast run through. Sorry for our technical challenges on the front end. I think the virus, unfortunately, is going to be with us for well into 2021. I don't think we're going to have a vaccine available until the early parts of next year, maybe at the earliest latter parts of this year. The vaccine will preferentially go to those people at risk and those frontline healthcare workers. I think it's while we prepaid for a lot of it, it'll take a while for it to become open for the general population. And even then, I think low uptake in the general population will continue to have the risk be present in our communities for a long period of time. So Tim, let me pause there, and we'll go to Ross or take questions, however you want to do it.
We'll take questions. A great presentation, Dr. Joe and Sandra, and thank you, Sandra, for sticking with it. We appreciate all you do, both of you, obviously. Questions? So let's ask some great questions here. Sarah, you want to start us off?
I actually don't have a question this week, which is strange, I know, but I'm just frustrated with the university, like how that's been handled. I feel like them coming back with sororities and fraternities and moving into the dorms was a little bit, like, I understand why we have to get our school districts back to school, but college students didn't have to come back and party, I don't think, but what's been done has been done, so hopefully they can fix it. But it's a great presentation. I guess I do have one question. So the Iceland study that said 91% of people developed antibodies, because I've seen these weird anecdotal stories about someone had COVID and then a month and a half later they get it again. And so I guess that would, you know, be the 9% of people, like a rare thing.
So there are two, for a long time, that was a false anecdote. We did not have anywhere in the world evidence that somebody had contracted it twice.
Okay.
About 3 weeks ago, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, there have been reports of 2 or 3 people now in the international space, probably that have traveled to different parts of the world and picked up different strains of the virus that did come down with a second round of it, but it was probably a different strain that the immunity that they had generated to the first strain did not protect them from the second strain. So
That
I
makes
think,
sense.
again, we're continuing to learn here. I do not think you have evidence of repeat infections here in the United States from the same strain of virus once you've developed an antibody to that.
Okay. It's just fake news on Facebook.
Well, a concern that we all have because, you know, this is a new virus. We don't know how our body's going to react to it. We don't know if we're going to develop antibodies. That's where I think that Icelandic study is a positive contribution in that 91% of people who had been tested positive did ultimately develop antibodies, and it lasted for 4 months. Now, that's 4 months. I'd rather it be 6 months or 8 months, but they'll follow those people, and we'll have an early, you know, line of sight on how long the antibodies last as they continue to monitor those individuals.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you, Sarah. Other questions?
Hey, Tim, I've got a question.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Thompson. That was very informative and a bit alarming in some cases. So the heart damage slide that you showed us, can you have a perspective or that you can share with us about the population for both those JAMA studies?
Sure. So the first population, people that were still alive, that had, you know, the 3/4 with evidence of some kind of dilatation of their ventricle or ongoing inflammation of their heart. You know, that was from a series. I think you know, on any of these studies, how you get into it is important, and who selects how you get into it is even probably more important. And on that first study, I don't have good line of sight on how they selected them, other than 2/3 of the individuals had never been hospitalized. So these were people who had COVID, did not have it seriously enough to go to the hospital early on, but when they got followed up 2 months later, had kind of evidence of ongoing damage and even active inflammation. So that's, I think that study is a cause for concern. Obviously the case series of people who died and then they had an autopsy to look at the inflammation in their heart, that's probably a group of folks from a more academic setting where autopsies are consistently done. So I have a little caution on both of those, that those aren't general population studies, but the fact that the numbers are so high in both studies caused me some concern. They did not know these people had heart problems going in. In fact, in the first study, those individuals did not have heart problems preceding their COVID-19 infection.
Ross has a question.
Thank you.
Ross, do you have a question?
I couldn't let Joe get off without asking a question.
That's right.
Joe, I want to ask your opinion on this. There's been some debate recently about, are we treating outbreaks on college campuses correctly? And so my question is really, many believe that the worst thing that we could be doing is sending home college students to spread the virus more broadly if they're either under quarantine suspected of having it or actually have tested positive, that we may be spreading it even more rapidly by that, as opposed to many scholars believe what we should be doing is isolating students in dorms and in Greek life somewhere on campus to contain it. I just wanted to get your opinion on what you think is the correct approach. Thank you.
So, quote, the correct approach, I'm not sure exists, but let's unpack this a little bit. You know, I think there are some who recognize that this is a pandemic, that we as humans have never seen it before, and it's going to be a slow burn, and why don't we move forward with those who can tolerate the burn, and younger individuals can appear not to get as severely ill, and so why not contain them on a campus and let them become infected and potentially move us toward herd immunity faster, where you have individuals with antibodies. I think I think there's an upside to that if we were able to contain them on campuses. The problem is 80% of your University of Arkansas students don't live on the campus, they live in the community, so it's a community exposure. I think the other issue there, and this is really just the recognition of reality, not all of those students are immunocompetent and healthy. There's a small percentage of those students who have high risks for bad outcomes with COVID, whether they're on high dose steroids because of a rheumatologic condition, whether they may have cancer. I mean, as this virus infects more and more people, we're going to see more and more kind of clinical conditions for which a few people have really bad outcomes. So if you have 40,000 students, there's a certain proportion of those students that are going to have a really bad outcome if you let it burn there. So the two things for the Fayetteville community, just the University of Arkansas, it could be any other community, it's the community exposure and it's the small number of students that would have an adverse outcome. I am very concerned as these students go back home, where you've got mom, grandmom, aunt, and uncle that are an older population. This is a very infectious virus, and when it transmits to those individuals, that's where you could have a larger number of people with potentially bad outcomes become exposed and infected. So I think this is there is no correct answer. I think there is logic here. And I think, unfortunately, fun sometimes trumps logic. And we need to figure out how we optimize the protections that we can be put in place.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Dr. Joe, that was a wonderful update. We appreciate it. You do educate us each time we get to be with you. And
well, I'll look for that quote, "Fun sometimes trumps logic," in somebody's letter to the editor.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I wish we could contain it. That'd be like the NBA's bubble, except in reverse, right, Ross? Yeah, if we could,
Yes.
They could just stay there and party inside their dorm or their attorney house. Yeah. Okay. No other questions? Last chance. Dr. Joe, thank you. We appreciate you very much.
Sure. Well, I'm going to try to stick on with you so I can ask Ross a question here in a few minutes.
I hope you will. We hope you will.